Hey guys, welcome back to Beyond God and Religion. In my last video, we focused on the true history of what happened between the Mormon settlers and the native Timpanogos who were living in Utah. And in this video, we're going to be focusing more on the modern church's handling of what happened in their past. We'll be addressing some more of the ill-advised comments that the Midnight Mormons made in their video. And lastly, I'll be showing you where those quotes came from that the Midnight Mormons accused me of handwriting myself. To begin, we know exactly how the modern Mormon church has handled its history because they wrote an essay about it specifically addressing this topic. And it isn't long, so we'll go ahead and address that right now. Here's how the essay begins. Like other settlers in frontier areas, Latter-day Saints occupied areas already inhabited by American Indians. The tragic history of the annihilation of many Indian tribes and the devastation of others at the hands of European immigrant settlers and the United States military and political apparatus has been well documented by historians. Settlers throughout the 19th century, including some Latter-day Saints, mistreated and killed Indians in numerous conflicts, forcing them off desirable lands and onto reservations. So right off the bat, the church is saying, you guys don't get to single us out. We were just one of the groups that was murdering the natives. So, yeah. And that's really not a very promising beginning to an essay that's designed to make the church not look culpable for what they did. The most enraging part of that first paragraph is how the church tries to pretend and gaslight and blatantly lie that it was just some random Mormons who were involved in this kind of behavior against the Native Americans, when what really happened was the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the First Presidency got together and issued an extermination order. So when they try to make it like, yeah, like we just had some members of our group who, were so embarrassed by them, they're trying to make the people who did this and put them outside of the church. Because that way they can say, oh, well, of course people are imperfect. So people make mistakes. And so you can't judge, an organization by the worst of its members. This was a directive that was issued from the highest levels of the Mormon church. And to pretend otherwise is disgusting. And the BS continues. Unlike most other Americans, Latter-day Saints viewed Indians as a chosen people, fellow Israelites who were descendants of Book of Mormon peoples and thus heirs to God's promises. We're going to pause right there. Here's a really interesting Brigham Young quote. Let any man or company of men be familiar with Indians, and they will be more familiar. And the more familiar you will find, the less influence you have with them. If you would have dominion over them for their good, which is the duty of the elders, you must not treat them as your equals. You cannot exalt them by this process. If they are your equals, you cannot raise them up to you. In other words, if you don't treat them like slaves, they might begin to think that they're not slaves, and that's a problem. You have been too familiar with them. Your children have mixed promiscuously with them. They have been free in your houses, and some of the brethren have spent too much time in smoking and chatting with them. And instead of teaching them to labor, such a course has encouraged them in idleness and ignorance, the effects of which you begin to feel. You must now rid yourselves of these evils the best way you can. As church president, territorial governor, and territorial superintendent of Indian affairs, Brigham Young pursued a peace policy to facilitate Mormon settlement in areas where Indians lived. Latter-day Saints learned Indian languages, established trade relations, preached the gospel, and generally sought accommodation with Indians. This policy, however, emerged unevenly and was inconsistently applied. Unevenly and inconsistently applied. Well, that's one way to say extermination order. Peaceful accommodation between Latter-day Saints and Indians was both the norm and the ideal. Yeah, okay, Mormon Church, where did 70,000 natives disappear off to? And doubling down on their earlier deception, at times, however, church members clashed violently with Indians. Yep, it was definitely just some random church members who were definitely not acting in accordance to the commands they were given from their prophet and leaders of their church. These two cultures, European and American Indian, had vastly different assumptions about the use of land and property and did not understand each other well. Mormons often accused Indians of stealing. Indians, meanwhile, believed the Mormons had a responsibility to share goods and livestock raised on Indian tribal lands. In areas where Mormons settled, Indian experience with Europeans had previously consisted mostly of mutually beneficial interactions with trappers and traders, people who passed through the land or briefly dwelled on it, not staked permanent claim to it as the Mormons did. These misunderstandings led to friction and violence between the peoples. A misunderstanding, huh? This would be like somebody walking into a Mormon temple and being like, all right, everybody out, this is mine now. And then when they're like, no, you can't do that, this is ours. The dude just wipes everybody out in the building. And then later the Mormon church reaches out to the person and is like, dude, I can't believe that you did that. And then the guy's like, bro, chill. It was just a misunderstanding. In late 1849, tensions between Ute Indians and Mormons in Utah Valley escalated after a Mormon killed a Ute known as Old Bishop, who he accused of stealing his shirt. Really quickly, this is historically inaccurate. Old Bishop was not a Ute. The Utes didn't come until 1881. They were sent here from Colorado as prisoners of war, and so this didn't happen. There weren't even Utes in Utah for another 32 years. So not only did the church completely bastardize the history, they didn't even get the tribe they were murdering right. The Mormon and two associates then hid the victim's body in the Provo River. Details of the murder were likely withheld, at least initially, from Brigham Young and other church leaders. Settlers at Fort Utah did, however, report other difficulties with the Indians, including the firing of weapons at settlers and the theft of livestock and crops. Brigham Young counseled patients, telling them to stockade your fort, to attend to your own affairs and let the Indians take care of theirs. Nevertheless, tensions mounted at Fort Utah, in part because local Mormons refused to turn over those involved in the murder of Old Bishop to the Utes or to pay reparations for his death. In the winter of 1849 to 1850, a measles epidemic spread from the Mormon settlers to the Ute camps, Ute meaning Timpanogos, killing many Indians and heightening tensions. At a council of church leaders in Salt Lake City on January 31, 1850, the leader of Fort Utah reported that the Utes' actions and intentions were growing increasingly aggressive. Can't imagine why. They say they mean to hunt our cattle and go and get the other Indians to kill us. In response, Governor Young authorized a campaign, aka extermination order, against the Utes, which was really the Timpanogos. A series of battles in February 1850 resulted in the deaths of dozens of Utes and one Mormon. In these instances and others, some Latter-day Saints committed excessive violence against native peoples. Talk about making a molehill out of a mountain. Here's the last part. Nevertheless, for the most part, the Saints had more amicable relations with Indians than did settlers in other areas of the American West. Which is kind of like a Ted Bundy saying, well, I'm no Jeffrey Dahmer. Brigham Young enjoyed friendships with several American Indian leaders and taught his people to live peaceably with their Indian neighbors whenever possible, which of course wouldn't have included the times when Brigham Young was like, hey, go exterminate them. The other times. Some Indians even distinguished between Mormonese, whom they considered friendly, and other American settlers who were known as Maracats. I love that ending. See, you guys, the Timpanogos absolutely loved that the Mormons came to stay. And don't forget, you can always trust the Mormon Church to give you the 100% true version of what happened between them and the natives. As we've just seen, the church's retelling of this history is an absolute dumpster fire. It's nothing more than church lawyers masquerading about as though they were historians, and it did not end well. But maybe there's a part of you that is super wishful thinking and just hoping that maybe the church has apologized for what they did. Have they? Heber C. Kimball, who was one of the original Mormon 12 apostles and who served as Brigham Young's first counselor in the first presidency, discouraged the idea of paying the Indians for the land, for if the Shoshones should be thus considered, the Utes and other tribes would claim pay also. The land belongs to our Father in heaven, and we calculate to plow and plant it. And no man shall have the power to sell his inheritance, for he cannot remove it. It belongs to the Lord. Now, that quote was from a long time ago, but how about more recently? Maybe 2015? I know that the history of the church is not to seek apologies or to give them. We sometimes look back on issues and say, maybe that was counterproductive for what we wish to achieve. This is a classic example of if you give it to one, you have to give it to all. And there are so many people and groups of people who deserve apologies from the Mormon Church, and so they never give one, because if they do, that opens the floodgates. It's pretty baffling to me that the Mormon Church is really out here trying to convince the world that it is the one and only true church, and they can't even choke through the words, "we're sorry," to a group of natives that they enslaved and murdered by the tens of thousands. Now, from time to time, I do get active Mormons who insist that the church has apologized for everything that they have done, and they send me the same old conference talk by Dieter Uchtdorf, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at it right now because it is not an apology. We openly acknowledge that in nearly 200 years of church history, along with an uninterrupted line of inspired, honorable, and divine events, there have been some things said and done that could cause people to question. On the right you see SCORE, S-C-O-R-E, and each component is what makes an apology an apology. And let's go ahead and see if any one of these is done by the apology listed by Dieter Uchtdorf. S is for surrender. Does it give up the desire to defend what they did? No. C, confession. Does it specifically acknowledge each wrong fully? No, it doesn't mention anything specifically. O, ownership. Does it acknowledge the active role they had in the wrongdoing? No. R, restitution. Does it fairly compensate the person or group for what was done? Not even close. And E, empathy. Does it validate their experience even if yours was different? No, he simply gaslights. All that Dieter is saying here is that some stuff happened, and some people could misinterpret those events or have them be misconstrued to get them to the point where they think the church did something that was really wrong. And you notice how he also counterbalances that by saying, look at all the amazing things we did, though, which is basically presupposing that a good thing that you do negates or wipes out something bad that you do. And that is not how life works. He then goes on to gaslight the audience. There may have been things said or done that were not in harmony with our values, principles, or doctrine. Rather than apologizing, when Dieter says this, he is simply absolving the church of ever having to take responsibility for anything. It's leaving it completely ambiguous and up in the air. The jury is still out. The jury is still out because the Mormon church has locked the door. This is what accountability does and does not look like. It is not, I meant well. It is not, that was not my intent. It is, I broke the egg. Then he just makes it worse. Sometimes questions arise because we simply don't have all the information and we just need to be a bit more patient. When the entire truth is eventually known, things that didn't make sense to us before will be resolved to our satisfaction. Really, Dieter? We don't have enough information already? We don't already have a vast amount of disgusting, racist, malevolent teachings and signed extermination orders proving that this is true? That the church did these things proudly? We need more information? So let me get this straight. As long as there is something, anything that we don't know, that's reason enough to throw out everything that we do know, that we do have every reason to believe is true, and just remain impartial? Well, that's convenient. And the time that Dieter's referring to, where we'll all be sat down and have it explained to us, is obviously his punt into the next life, where as long as we just wait until after we die, which is also when we can't do anything in this life to make the situation better, then good old Jesus is going to sit us down and explain it to us, and our response will be, oh man, I get it now. Holy cow, I'm so glad I didn't leave the church and that I kept paying my tithing, because my friends didn't, and now they're burning in hell. So all he's saying here is just shut up and move on. Just punt it into the next life and deal with it then, because we don't want to have to deal with it now. And speaking of this punting it into the next life thing, do you guys think that Dieter Uchtdorf would let me borrow a large sum of money from him in this life with the promise that in the next life I will not only return it back to him, but I will return it to him 100 times? You guys think he'd go for it? Yeah, I didn't either, because this is a one-way street where the Mormon church gets to ask you to wait, but you don't get to ask the Mormon church for shit. What Dieter Uchtdorf is asking us to do is actually a textbook logical fallacy called appeal to ignorance. This fallacy occurs when someone argues that because something hasn't been proven to be 100% one way or the other, that no conclusion should be reached. So for example, a detective says, we have strong, irrefutable evidence linking you to the crime scene. And then the defendant says, that may be true, but since there might still be things you don't know that may show up later to prove I'm innocent, you can't convict me. Just like the defendant here, Dieter Uchtdorf is using this fallacy by implying that the church's innocence should be presumed until we know absolutely everything, which will never happen. So not only is it a dishonest way to avoid having to accept that we have more evidence than we could ever need to come to the conclusion that the church isn't true, and that these men are not speaking for a God in the sky, but it's identical to a very risky strategy some people employ in poker. And the poker strategy I'm referring to here is, of course, chasing the straight. Now, since the Mormon prophets have declared that face cards are a tool of the devil, I'm going to go ahead and explain this so that all those, including the uninitiated, will know what I'm talking about. Chasing the straight refers to a situation where a player is trying to complete a straight hand, which is a hand consisting of 5 consecutive cards of any suit. So, for example, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. That would be a straight, and it's a really good hand. In Texas Hold'em, which is a variety of poker, at the beginning of each round you are given 2 cards, and then throughout the round 5 cards are incrementally laid out on the table face up so everyone can see them, and everyone wants to create the best possible hand with what's on the table and with what they have in their hand, and that's how you win the game. So let's say that in your hand you have the 6 and the 7, and then down on the table is the 8 and the 9. What that means is the only card you need left is either a 10 or a 5 that will complete your straight, and then you'll win the game. But you realize that the odds of the last card being placed down there is not likely to be either of the cards that you need. And so do you fold or do you chase the straight? Wanting desperately to win the game, you decide to ignore the odds that are not in your favor and keep gambling higher and higher, refusing to fold, hoping that the last card that is laid down on the table will be precisely the card you need in order to win the game. Rarely does this strategy pan out, and a lot of people have lost it all because they decided to chase the straight. So when people like Dieter Uchtdorf say, "We just don't have all the answers," what they're really saying is this: I'm willing to ignore all of the evidence that has been placed before me on the table, in the hopes that one day some finding will come about that will give me exactly what I need, and so I can say I was right all along. So essentially, Dieter is asking you to chase the straight. And not only that, but to ignore all of the pain and suffering that has happened that the church itself has perpetuated and caused. Because maybe the last card on the table will be, holy cow, the Mormon church was right. No. And even if there was a God, and he was good, why would he ever be asking you to ignore the pain and suffering of his other creations because maybe, just maybe, the Mormon church might be his? This is the last excuse that Dieter Uchtdorf offers, which confirms that there was no apology to be found anywhere in this talk. Let's take a look. This is the dumbest and most cliche argument that I hear about this. I suppose the church would only be perfect if it were run by perfect beings. God is perfect and his doctrine is pure. But he works through us, his imperfect children, and imperfect people make mistakes. So essentially what Dieter is saying here is that the church would absolutely love to apologize for their unscrupulous, murderous past, but fortunately they don't have to because people aren't perfect. And because nobody's perfect, everybody needs to just shut the hell up and quit whining and let anything they do go. Because if you don't, you're a hypocrite. Okay, so everything that we've discussed so far, from part 1 up until now, we can take all of that suffering and that enslavement and that murder, the extermination order, and we can just sweep it under the rug by calling it a mistake. Yeah, no. Intentionally and systematically eradicating almost every member of an indigenous population doesn't get to qualify as a mistake. This was not a whoopsies, and pretending otherwise is pretty damn obscene. If Mormons want to trivialize the extermination order that was leveled against them, they are more than welcome to do so, but they do not get to tell another group to trivialize their own, especially when they were the perpetrators. So, to finish this one off, there is not a single instance in these quotes that we've just gone over that even remotely qualifies as an apology. But let's talk about what deflection is for a minute. If you ever needed a single word that fully encapsulates how the Mormon church deals with handling its own sins, this is it. Deflection, a psychological strategy where someone shifts the focus of a conversation away from a particular idea that might imply wrongdoing. The goal is to redirect attention and subsequent scrutiny away from oneself or one's actions to avoid accountability, discomfort, or criticism. So, for example, suppose there's a discussion about a team project where one member, Alex, didn't contribute much and caused delays. When confronted about his lack of contribution, Alex responds by saying, well, let's not forget that we also had technical issues with our tools that slowed us down. In this example, instead of addressing his own lack of effort and contribution to the project, Alex deflects owning his behavior by introducing a new topic, technical issues, with the intention of conveniently diverting attention away from what he ought to be accountable for. By focusing on the technical issues, Alex avoids having to take any ownership for how his behavior impacted the project. So when you've been doing this long enough, you eventually start to see patterns in how the church operates, and some of them are actually hilarious. Because the church has this whole narrative of like, we are following God, what we tell you to do is only what God has been telling us to tell you to do, so you have to do it. But then when the church realizes that it has royally screwed up, it has to make a U-turn. And then it has to try to find a way to explain to the membership that like, this was on purpose. We knew this was coming because we're prophets who speak for God. So one of my absolute favorite, most chef's kiss examples of this is when the church taught for like over 150 years that people of color were cursed because they were just like shitty in the life before this one, where we were like preparing to come down here and get bodies and learn how to be good Christians and stuff. And then they realized this racism stuff doesn't seem to be going as hot as it once was. We need to change our narrative. And they had to like take it all back and make it make sense. So, for example, Bruce R. McConkie says, "There are statements in our literature by the early brethren which have been interpreted to mean that the Negroes would not receive the priesthood in mortality. I have said the same things. All I can say to that is it is time disbelieving people repented and got in line and believed in a living modern prophet." Forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young or President George Q. Cannon or whomever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding and without the light and knowledge that has now come into the world. We get our truth and our light line upon line and precept upon precept. We have now had added a new flood of intelligence and light on this particular subject, and it erases all the darkness, and all the views and all the thoughts of the past. They don't matter anymore. It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before the first day of June of this year, which was 1978. It is a new day and a new arrangement, and the Lord has now given the revelation that sheds light out into the world on this subject. As to any slivers of light or any particles of darkness of the past, we forget about them. So yeah, it was an absolute train wreck, and the most disgusting part was where Bruce tries to make it about the members' worthiness, if they have any issues, or it doesn't make sense to them why there's this big shift. He says, well, you guys just need to repent and get in line. Like, he literally says that. And since the Midnight Mormons are inevitably going to say that I just wrote this all up myself, here's a screenshot from the BYU website. All are alike unto God, Bruce R. McConkie. I've mentioned a few times how the church gaslights its membership, but what is gaslighting, and what are some specific examples of the church doing this?
Gaslighting, a form of emotional manipulation in which a person is made to question their own perception of reality. It often involves denying or trivializing another person's feelings or experiences, which can lead them to doubt their own memory, judgment, or sanity. So, for example, hey, this thing happened to me. It never happened to me. I don't think it happens. I'm telling you that it does. It happened to me too. It never happened to me. I don't think it happens.
So simply put, gaslighting allows you to control somebody else's experience and narrative of that experience. So for example, if I train somebody to not trust their own experience and that their interpretation is always wrong, and I train that into them, then they always come to me to ask me what just happened, and then I can tell them whatever version benefits me the most, and they will believe it.
So on the one hand, you have leaders like Alexander Morrison, who was in the Quorum of the 70, and who was actually in my ward growing up, and whose lessons I attended, who said things like, "How grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has from its beginnings stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations," which sounds wonderful until you realize that it's a complete fabrication. From the days of the prophet Joseph Smith, even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the church leaders, that the Negroes are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel. And given that the church has taught the exact opposite of what Elder Morrison was saying here for well over 150 years, and given that those teachings are now wildly accessible to anyone with Wi-Fi,
it's amazing that this is still the church's go-to technique to get members to toss out their own memories of all the times they've been taught this stuff, and it's really, really desperate. One of the most successful examples of how the church gaslights its membership is seen here in this quote, again by Dieter Uchtdorf.
Faith is to hope for things which are not seen, but which are true, true being the operative word. Therefore, please first doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith.
So essentially what he's saying here is, all that stuff that's caused you to doubt, the stuff you've read, the stuff that you felt deep inside that you know is valid, just throw it out. Just doubt that instead of doubting what we have told you is the truth. Here's a really good example for why that is just a terrible idea.
This is your captain speaking. A warning light came on which gave us a brief concern about the integrity of engine number 2. However, I've instructed the crew to doubt their doubts, and we will be taking off right on schedule. Enjoy the flight. Telling someone to doubt their doubts is a perfect example of where the church subtly gaslights its members. Essentially, people are being asked to arbitrarily disregard their own thoughts, feelings, experiences, and intuitions and unquestioningly adopt a prescribed perspective that conveniently supports only one single narrative. Guess whose it is? The church's.
The church tries to sell this idea as though it was an act of faith, but it's not. And faith is something that people are only taught to see as a good thing, but there's a shadow side to it that most believers are not willing to accept.
This quote represents the shadow side of faith, where it manifests not as the virtue like it's typically seen to be, but rather as a sneaky cancerous vice. Science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved. Really let that one sink in. After all, what was it that fueled 9/11? Faith. Why are gay people still being thrown off roofs today around the world? Faith in things that are not true, but that people believe to be true. Because the faithful don't rely on science or critical thinking to justify or substantiate their beliefs, they become prime targets for manipulation and abuse. And all the while, they're fully believing that they are the only ones seeing clearly and that heaven awaits them. And unfortunately, as a result of this faith, once someone is truly convinced that they have found God and that He's on their side, there's almost no way to deter them, and that's dangerous. Carl Sagan very aptly said, "One of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we have been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back."
And ironically, even though believers have been trained to think that they are the only ones who see clearly in a very flat-earther style of thinking, they're actually very easy to spot because they say things like this.
All of my core beliefs are at odds with the scientific consensus on literally everything. How could all those scientists be so wrong?
Because the church membership has been trained to think in this very, very problematic red flag kind of way, that's why they can say things like what I'm about to show you and have the membership go, "Yep, nothing wrong here." Here's a few examples.
Chapter 31 on honesty from the Gospel Principles Manual. There are many other forms of lying. When we speak untruths, we are guilty of lying. We can also intentionally deceive others by a gesture or a look, by silence, or by telling only part of the truth. And then ironically, Boyd K. Packer, an apostle for the church, says, "There's a temptation for the writer or the teacher of church history to want to tell everything, whether it is worthy or faith-promoting or not. Some things that are true are not very useful." So, pretty inconsistent, right? Boyd also had this to say. "I have a hard time with historians because they idolize the truth. The truth is not uplifting, it destroys. Historians should tell only that part of the truth that is inspiring and uplifting." So, mixed messages. And here's this one from the Current Prophet. "Truth is truth. Some things are simply true. The arbiter of truth is God, not your favorite social media newsfeed, not Google, and certainly not those who are disaffected from the church."
Yes, truth can even be used to convey a lie. Indeed, in some instances, the merciful companion to truth is silence. Some truths are better left unsaid. And then there's this one that comes from the prophet's wife, who somehow is also a therapist. She says, "I suggest we compare anything and everything we read, view, or hear with the teachings of the prophets. If it isn't in harmony, we should run away." So basically, outsource your thinking to a third party and don't think that you know what's best for you.
James did not say, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him Google." And then there's Down Oaks, who said, "I suggest that research is not the answer."
It's so fascinating that this is what the church teaches now, because it wasn't always this way. If we have the truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. If we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed. It's easy to bluff and pretend that you're bulletproof during a time when science hasn't really been developed to the point where it can test the claims that you're making. But as science has developed, the claims of religious people and religious thinking has come into a scope where it can be tested and proven wrong, and that's not been good for religion. Here's something that former prophet Joseph Fielding Smith had to say on this topic. I have not felt that I am under any obligation to accept the theories which are based on scientific research, but have the divine right to question them. I am, however, under obligation to accept revealed truth which comes through the openings of the heavens from the one who comprehendeth all things. And when I find that what I believe to be a conflict between the theories of men and the word of the Lord, I am bold to say that I accept the latter with full confidence that the theories must be changed. As science continues to unravel religious claims, there are people within the organization who know that the gig is up. This quote comes from prominent LDS historian Richard Bushman, who says, I think that for the church to remain strong, it has to reconstruct its narrative. The dominant narrative is not true. It can't be sustained. The church has to absorb all this new information or it will be on very shaky grounds. A little late for that. And that's what it's trying to do. And it will be a strain for a lot of people, older people especially. But I think it has to change. If this very damning admission from one of the church's top historians can't be seen as true, then what can be? Now, in this same vein of knowing that something is wrong, but not really having the guts to admit it and actually come clean about what you know deep down is true, let's get back to something that the Midnight Mormons had to say.
I'm like, all right, Brigham Young, he's nobody's favorite prophet in the church. Everyone knows I will go to bat for Joseph Smith. I don't feel the need to defend Brigham Young.
This is called playing dumb. Let's take a look at another prophet, the first one in Mormonism that was also racist. Had I anything to do with the Negro, I would confine them to their own species. Joseph Smith. And no, that's not the only one. There's plenty more just like this one. Are the Mormons abolitionists? No, unless delivering the whole people from priestcraft and the priests from the power of Satan should be considered abolition, but we do not believe in setting the Negroes free. And to nip the idea that only some of the Mormon prophets were racist in the bud, here's a few more. Coming back to Joseph Smith, the first mention we have of slavery is found in the Holy Bible, pronounced by a man who was perfect in his generation and walked with God. Brigham Young, inasmuch as we believe in the Bible, inasmuch as we believe in the ordinances of God, in the priesthood and order and decrees of God, we must believe in slavery. David O. McKay, the seeming discrimination by the church toward the Negro is not something which originated with man, but goes back into the beginning, with God. George Albert Smith, from the days of the prophet Joseph Smith even until now, it has been the doctrine of the church, never questioned by any of the leaders, that the Negroes are not entitled to the full blessings of the gospel. Genuinely asking, how do you make it work? How do you have these men as people who spoke for God, who were also racist, claiming that it was the doctrine, not just an opinion, but the actual official doctrine of the church, that people of color were inferior? How do you make that work? It seems like you're in what's called a double bind.
A double bind occurs when a person faces a dilemma in which whatever action they take, they are bound to experience frustration, confusion, and helplessness as there is no satisfactory way to respond. This is the double bind that believing members have to reconcile. A. God is indeed racist and these men were just speaking his word. Or B. These men were lying about speaking for God and used this lie to gain power, and I might add to exploit those weaker than themselves for their own personal gain. Now, one of these has to be true. It doesn't take a degree or a high IQ to figure this out. It only takes honesty and a willingness to accept the truth, even if it causes you pain.
When I was still a believing member, and I encountered information like the stuff I've been talking about in Part 1 and Part 2 of this series, I realized that big consequences were coming my way. I knew that something was wrong, and I had to decide what to do about it. And I knew that if I stayed, I would avoid a lot of pain. But then I also realized that if I stayed, I wouldn't be able to like myself anymore because I knew that it was wrong. And I knew that I'd be perpetuating a lie, and not just perpetuating it, but living it. Having it be my everyday, and that wasn't okay with me. And since I realized that pain was going to happen either way, it became irrelevant as to which way I should go, and so I needed to find a different value to help me make up my mind as to what to do. I decided to make the pain mean something, and I knew that I was going to lose a lot of people, and I knew that I was going to hurt really bad. And boy, is that an understatement. But I also realized that this choice was giving me the gift of proving to myself that all those times as a believing member when I bore my testimony about the importance of truth and that I would be willing to suffer for it and that I'd be willing to accept it no matter how brutal it was, I wasn't full of shit. And I know I'm on a bit of a soapbox right now, but that was the moment of my life where I decided that internal harmony was more important to me than external validation, no matter whose validation it was, and no matter how much I craved it. Looking back now at that decision, that was when pain became less important than truth. And I decided that I would accept and try to integrate as much truth, no matter how brutal or challenging it was, into my life that I possibly could. But enough about me. Let's get back to it. Kwaku, here's the uncomfortable, even devastating truth.
If there is a God, and he's the all-knowing, all-benevolent being that believers claim he must be in order to be God in the first place, why on earth would this God operate through men who he knew in advance would misrepresent him so greatly? Are we really going to entertain the possibility that out of the literally limitless options that would be before an all-powerful God, Brigham Young was the best from which this God had to choose? If your God is real and truly does embody all the magnificent traits that I've mentioned, what a waste to see it all coming slowly down the tracks and then doing nothing to intervene. What do you think he was thinking and feeling as he watched his one true people do what they did to the natives decade after decade? Did God just not love his native children as much as his white and delightsome ones? Or is this just another punted into the next life kind of thing?
And to further complicate your argument, let's take a look at a few quotes from your prophets about prophets. The Lord will never permit me or any man who stands as president of this church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. If I were to attempt that, the Lord would remove me out of my place. And so he will with any other man who attempts to lead the children of men astray from the oracles of God and from their duty. You keep your eye upon him whom the Lord called, and I say to you now, knowing that I stand in this position, you don't need to worry about the president of the church ever leading people astray, because the Lord would remove him out of his place before he would ever allow that to happen. And this same rhetoric continued being taught all the way up to Gordon B. Hinckley, who was my prophet, all the way through high school. The church is true. Those who lead it have only one desire, and that is to do the will of the Lord. They seek his direction in all things. There is not a decision of significance affecting the church and its people that is made without prayerful consideration going to the fount of all wisdom for direction. Follow the leadership of the church. God will not let his work be led astray. So I guess the question is an extermination order significant? And unfortunately for the Mormon Church, he even goes on to say this: each of us has to face the matter. Either the church is true or it is a fraud. There is no middle ground. It is the church and kingdom of God, or it is nothing. If any of these men were in fact prophets speaking for God, then what you also have to accept is that it was God calling for the extermination and enslavement of these beautiful native people, not just Brigham Young. If you're really going to keep claiming that these men are speaking for an all-benevolent, all-knowing God, you're simply playing a rigged game where you can only be right and I can only be wrong. Sorry, gents, but the math just ain't mathin'. And to hold on to this dogmatic and obviously fallacious perspective is to broadcast openly to the whole world that you've simply closed your eyes to the facts and you couldn't be more intellectually dishonest.
Take as long as you need with this, but the correct answer is B.
Before we move on, there's one more little thing that Kwaku said in that last quote that I want to look at a little bit more deeply.
Brigham Young, he's nobody's favorite prophet in the church.
Now, Kwaku, I don't know if you saw this or not, but did you read the comments from active Mormons who were disagreeing with you on this point?
For the record, Brigham is my favorite prophet. If it's even possible to have a favorite prophet, he absolutely rocks. He knows how to peel back the veil for me so I see the eternities and feel to drop my sins and become more like Christ. And I'm not white. I'm among those listed as accursed people in the Book of Mormon, and I love that prophet second only to Christ and Joseph. I will be walking up to thank him for his ministry day one when I get to the other side.
That's pretty bad.
Brigham Young is my second favorite prophet after Joseph. Truly a great man who did many miracles in building the Western wasteland into civilization. I love Brigham Young. He kept the church together during a difficult time. You should interview Daniel Peterson from the Interpreter Foundation. He will give you a newfound respect for Brigham Young. Love you guys in all of your debunking videos. And then there's this doozy of a comment that got 46 likes. Hell yeah. The more I learn about Brigham Young, the more impressed I become. For a little while, I held my nose when talking about Brigham Young in church, but I continued to study and learn about him, and now I revere him. He wasn't perfect, but he was quite an amazing man and absolutely dedicated to the Lord and exterminating people, it turns out. Anyway, then Chris comes in, Adam God theory, his prophetic position on blacks, you really give the guy a break. And then Sachs becomes in with an absolute whiz-banger of an idea. Yeah, well, how did his cities compare to modern cities' crime rate?
Because all it takes to wipe away slavery and racism is good crime rates. Religious people really do just tell on themselves, don't they? In their response video, the Midnight Mormons said a lot of very silly things, and there's a whole lot more than what I showed you in part 1, so let's get into that now.
That's the epitome of ex-Mormon, anti-Mormonism right there. Twisting something beautiful into something evil.
So, Cardin, essentially what you're saying is I've taken it out of context.
So what I'm often told is, Kyle, you took it out of context. You took those verses about racism and genocide and ethnic cleansing and genital mutilation, and you took them out of their good and proper context and put them into a bad one. To which I always respond, okay, then give me the good and proper context, because if I'm putting them in a bad context, surely there is a good context, right? And if you can't do that, then it's not a contextual issue. If you can't describe the good and proper context in which burning witches and ethnic cleansing and genocide and all that fun stuff is a good thing, then, my dear homie, it is not a contextual issue. And this is typically the point in the conversation where the Christian has to either start defending racism and slavery or admit that their God's a little bit of a fuckface.
So, Cardin, we're all very intrigued. Give us the good and proper context, in which case enslaving and murdering natives is a good thing. While Cardin's getting that ready for us, we're going to go ahead and listen to another thing that he had to say.
I'm sorry, anti-Mormons, you didn't prove us wrong.
Yeah, I did. In every single instance of every single word of every single quote that I shared, so you don't have an argument there at all. And it wasn't really hard to disprove your claims, because all it took was putting my Wi-Fi to good use, something you could have done, but chose not to. Before we move on, I want to draw attention to a logical fallacy that Cardin used over and over and over throughout their video.
Is this guy anti-Mormon?
The fact that you think this question is even valid or has anything to do with the validity of the arguments or claims that I make shows that you don't do very much debating, at least not in any successful way, because this is a textbook logical fallacy called ad hominem.
The ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone attacks the person making the argument rather than addressing the argument itself. So, for example, person A says, I believe that Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon contains historical inaccuracies, inconsistencies, and anachronisms. And then person B says, your argument's just anti-Mormon propaganda meant to undermine my faith. You're clearly biased and can't be trusted. In this example, instead of addressing the substance of person A's argument, person B simply tries to boot them from the discussion for being, quote, anti-Mormon. When you redirect the focus away from the argument and onto the person, it's easy for people to assume that you don't have much of an argument.
Now that example is okay, but an even better example was the video description that you guys used for your response video. Let's take a look at it. So all of us within the church have met our fair share of anti-Mormons that think they know what really happened because they read some kind of cynical misrepresentation of church history and think they have the truth or the real story. Ex-Mormon anti-Mormonism has become so dependent upon half-truths that now they don't even want the half of the truth anymore and are literally just making up fake racist Brigham Young quotes, living up to every negative stereotype of ex-Mormon subreddit and the CES letter lazy learners. The latest anti-Mormon to beclown himself. Speaking of beclowning, my name, the middle name there, has one N. It's not very encouraging for you to make a response video about me, and you don't even get my freaking name spelled correctly, so whoopsies. But he is really just the representation of a wider problem of misinformative lies propagated by the anti-Mormon mob. 3 sentences, 7 times. That's good work. Very on brand. So, Cardin, let's go ahead and grant your claim that I'm an evil anti-Mormon. Okay. Even if that was true, the validity of my arguments has nothing to do with me personally. The message is independent from the messenger, and what's more, I know that you already know this. You know how when people bring up that Joseph Smith was cheating on Emma and having sex in the barn with a 14-year-old behind Emma's back, literally and figuratively? What do you guys always say? Well, he wasn't perfect, but he was still God's prophet, and just like that, separating the message from the messenger. And don't even try to tell me that this didn't happen, because your church wrote an essay on it. But Emma likely did not know about all of Joseph's sealings. He may have thought Emma's rejection of plural marriage exempted him from the law of Sarah. Her decision to not receive this law permitted him to marry additional wives without her consent. The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Joseph's close friends Heber C. and Violet Murray Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph several months before her 15th birthday. They didn't even have the decency to just call her a freaking 14-year-old. Although also very on brand. Let's take a look at another Midnight Mormon quote.
Because I know that what they're going to say in response to this, they're going to say, can you believe Ward Radio is saying that Brigham Young had no controversy with natives? That's not what we're saying.
Yup, that's why we're upset. Because Brigham Young didn't have controversy with the natives. Great work. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Kwaku, but I think you actually meant the opposite of what you're saying, because who on either side of the fence is upset because Brigham Young didn't have controversy? I'm just guessing here, but I'm assuming that what you meant to say was that it's unfair for people to get mad at Brigham Young when most of the people during his time were racist? Here's the answer to that one. It's not that they were uniquely racist, because they weren't. It's that they weren't uniquely not racist. People who only win participation trophies when it comes to critical thinking might feel that Brigham Young is judged more harshly and therefore unfairly because he wasn't the only racist of his time. Some people claim that this creates an unfair double standard where we impose a higher standard on him when, had we been alive when he was, we almost certainly would have held racist views too. But that's completely missing the point. So when Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and the others in your church who make this very eyebrow-raising claim preach things that end up being extremely harmful and damaging to other people, you think when it all comes crashing down, it's unfair to judge them by the standard to which they themselves claimed of their own volition? If you want to play in the major leagues, that means major league consequences. These prophets don't get the luxury of only having to face the consequences that an average person would. Anything less is just disgusting religious privilege. One of the things that I was taught in church was that when you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other. Let's take a look at another one.
It's one thing to make up fake quotes for a joke, but to make up fake quotes to purposefully evoke pain out of Native Americans who have such an oppressed history to gain cookie points with ex-Mormons, it's shocking.
You didn't protect the marginalized group, you perpetuated it.
Is that what I did? That's kind of interesting that you bring that up, because how many natives do you think came after me, all disgruntled and angry because I shared their side of the story? None. Now, I did have some natives reaching out to me, but it was to express gratitude because I was sharing their side of the story, which isn't typically told. Now, plot twist, were there any Mormons who commented on my video? What did they have to say? I'm so glad you asked.
Let's look at Todd Nelson, who in his comments made his membership in the church and his views about the natives very clear. Now, given how gross his comments were, I'm going to go ahead and skip reading them, but as you can see, some people, in order to not have to alter the church's narrative, which would imply that these men weren't, in fact, speaking for God, are left with the only remaining option,
which is to take the prophets at their word. Now, Todd obviously got a bunch of backlash for what he was saying, and he deleted his account, but not before I got screenshots.
So here's Todd. If any of you know him, let's get him some therapy or at least a straitjacket.
So yeah, that didn't go exactly how you planned, which again, on brand. So anyway, Midnight Mormons, I'm still really curious, how did you come to the conclusion that that was the motive behind me sharing all of these videos about what happened to the natives? That it was designed to evoke pain out of natives? That's quite the claim. Now, Midnight Mormons, I have a question for you. You guys seem to be very aware that the Utah natives have a history of being oppressed. Now, here's the question. Out of all of the diverse groups who settled in Utah in the 1800s, which out of all of those diverse groups do you think did the oppressing?
I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct answer.
Here's another question for you. So if my motive was indeed to evoke pain out of the natives, why? Why would I want to do that? Now, in your video, you actually listed two things, clout and money, that could have been my motivation for making the video that I did. And like most things, you didn't really think this one through, because it doesn't take any intelligence at all to realize and to be able to predict that a cis white male making fun of the extermination order leveled against the natives wouldn't exactly be the fastest and most efficient way to wealth and clout, as you called it. So I guess what I'm really getting at is, what is wrong with y'all's brains? To imply the things that you did about me wasn't just dishonest and stupid, it was just plain gross. And speaking of gross, I couldn't even believe that you guys said this.
I got to wrap this one up. I feel, why whenever we deal with these anti-Mormons, do you always just feel so dark inside afterwards? Just
faking
dark.
quotes about genocide is generally a very unpleasant thing.
Oof. Well, that was hard to watch, and given that I've substantiated every word of those quotes, it's kind of awkward now. And to make it even worse, you guys want to see Cardin call me to repentance?
By the way, let's see if he repents. We believe in repentance.
Oh,
Look,
boy.
I've messed up plenty of times in my life. Maybe this is a big fat mess up for you, Mr. Bishop, right? But now let's see what the behavior is of the
his
ex-mo
TikTok
community.
account is called Beyond God and Religion.
Oh boy.
Again, it's hard to find something more Mormon than that. And I love the part where you all recoiled at the words beyond God and religion, because, he must be an atheist, which is so absolutely crazy that I could be an atheist, considering that out of all the gods that have ever existed, you're just as atheist as me about all of them except one. I went one god further than you did, and I'm absolutely insane. Now, given that you guys made clear that repentance is a tippy-top priority for you guys in your life, I actually made a list of how you can get started.
So here's a quick recap of the most notable, salient claims that you guys made. And given that my response was quite thorough in dismantling your claims, I imagine you're probably feeling quite silly about this list, minus bullet point number 4, which in retrospect was fair. But for real, gentlemen, look at the things that you guys said. Pretty wild. Anyway, the story of Brigham Young and the natives isn't actually at all complex like you guys seem to make it. In fact, there's a Pocahontas clip that just about sums up the entire thing.
Williams, why do you think those insolent heathens attacked us?
Because we invaded their land and cut down their trees and dug up their earth.
It's the goal!
That is some top-shelf Disney, and guys, it is not as complicated as you are making it, okay? Occam's razor. Also, we've gone through a bunch of the crazy things that you guys have said, but this next part, I think, is the craziest thing that you guys said out of everything that you said.
And by the way, Brigham Young would never say that. Brigham Young didn't consider himself a white man. Did you know this?
What?
Brigham Young did not. The Mormons were considered a different race. And
Really?
So they say, Brigham Young and George Buchanan, they say, we are not the white man. We don't want to be like the white man. We don't want to dwell with the white man because they're a bunch of racists. They're violent. They hate us, and they're wicked. Brigham Young would never be caught dead saying like, oh, yes, we are white people. This is from the Fruits of Mormonism journal from the mid-19th century, Nathan Slater, page 30. You can go look this up. This actually does exist. The conduct of Joseph Smith and other leaders is such as no community of white men could tolerate. Right? John C.
Oh,
never
dude.
say this.
Oh, I love it.
So let me get this straight. Someone's like, I'm trans. And you're like, no, that's nonsense. And then Brigham Young's like, we ain't white people. And you guys are like, well, that checks out. All right. Like, I genuinely cannot believe that you guys said those words on the internet. The internet is forever. So I don't really even know what to say at this point, so we're just going to go on to the next one.
Secularism creates racism. Religion. It was pastors like Martin Luther King appealing to the Christian values of the North American continent and the black church that got rid of racism in the 1960s.
Yeah. You really just said those words. We got rid of racism in the 1960s, and secularism is what causes racism. Okay. Starting with religion, as the British historian Hugh Thomas noted in his monumental study, The Slave Trade, The Story of the Atlantic Slave, 1440 to 1870, there is no record in the 17th century of any preacher who in any sermon, whether in the Cathedral of St. Andre in Bordeaux or in a Presbyterian meeting house in Liverpool, condemned the trade in black slaves. For millennia, religions in general, and Jewish, Christian, and Islamic churches in particular, have had little problem with the forced enslavement of hundreds of millions of people. It was only after the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment that rational arguments were proffered for the abolition of the slave trade, influenced by and citing such secular documents as the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. After an unconscionably long lag time, religion finally got on board the abolition train and became instrumental in helping to propel it forward. Now, why do you think it took Christians so long to finally get on board? I don't know, maybe it had something to do with all the times where your God explicitly didn't just condone, but command slavery. So in Leviticus, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen, and are round about you. Of them ye shall buy bondmen and bondmaids. He goes even further to make clear that even children can be slaves. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy. And in verse 46 we read, And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. Then in Exodus we read, And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the manservants do. Because what's slavery without a little sexism? And then just a few verses later, your all-benevolent, loving God, who's definitely not racist, even grants permission to beat your slaves. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. And then in verse 21, Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. So you can beat your slaves, men, women, and children, but you just can't push it so far that they actually die, at least not for like 2 days, because then we know it was because you beat them, and that's why they died. And I know you guys like to say, well, that was the Old Testament, as though that were some sort of argument. But what's really interesting about Mormon theology is, and this is unique to Mormonism, is that Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, the guy who's commanding all of this, who is he? That's Jesus. So regardless of whether the verses come out of the Old or New Testament, it doesn't matter because it's the same guy, your God, not taking any issue with owning other human beings. And speaking of the New Testament, it's right here too, and this is just one of the verses that say this exact same thing. Slaves should remain submissive with every fear to masters, not only those who are good and gentle, but also those who are crooked. For this is favor, if, because of consciousness concerning God, one endures pain when suffering unjustly. And yet somehow you're really making the argument that it's because of Christianity that people said no more slavery when your God explicitly commanded it. You're not making a whole lot of sense. And what makes your argument even worse is that let's say I granted your argument, which, but let's say I do that. Were your church leaders in support of that or not? So any way you want to slice this, the result is the same. Christianity and your God are not the hero of this story. The heroes are the people who said, you know what, regardless of what's in the Bible, in fact, despite what's in the Bible, we are now saying no to this. Sam Harris made a really profound comment on this topic. It was even possible for the most venerated patriarchs of the church like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas to conclude that heretics should be tortured or killed. Martin Luther and John Calvin advocated the wholesale murder of heretics, apostates, Jews, and witches. You are, of course, free to interpret the Bible differently, though isn't it amazing that you have succeeded in discerning the true teachings of Christianity, while the most influential thinkers, and I would add your prophets, in the history of your faith failed. But sure, Cardin.
Let's see if he repents.
Why would I ever need to repent to be worthy of the forgiveness of a God who couldn't even figure out that slavery is wrong? When we look at the track record of the leadership of the people who have been at the top of your church, it's not hard to understand why they were so monstrous. Just look at what they believed in. Look at who they tried to emulate. Look who was their God. With or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. And yet somehow we need this God so much. We must prostrate ourselves in front of this God and beg for his mercy. Are you kidding me? A Jewish prisoner once etched into the wall at Auschwitz the words, "If there is a God, he will beg my forgiveness." He got it. I don't think it's crazy to imagine that a good portion of the native Timpanogos who were killed by the Mormon settlers thought the exact same thing before they died. But I won't speak for them. And let's not forget the part where you contradicted what you previously said, that racism has been eradicated.
They always accidentally stumble into racism in their fervor of trying to make the church look bad.
Wait, I thought racism was eradicated. Oh, just not when it has anything to do with ex-Mormons. Then racism is very real, and you have to be careful not to become ex-Mormon because then you'll be a racist? Woo! Wrapping this all up now, we're going to look at a few more things the Midnight Mormons had to say, and then we're going to get to the part I have been promising from the beginning. Where did those quotes I shared come from? So hang tight.
Think how many lies are in the ex-Mormon, anti-Mormon zeitgeist right now that are just garbage.
Well, that didn't age well.
It's pathetic if it weren't so, unfortunately, effectively destructive on so many of these families. How many broken homes do we have because there's idiots that believe fake quotes like this?
Yes. Yes.
Now, I'm not holding my breath, but maybe you can see a little bit better after this presentation than you could before why it's so effective. It's because it's irrefutable, and irrefutable evidence pointing to one side of a coin and not the other is pretty damn convincing. And in addition, when you blame the people who did the work, who did the research, who bravely looked at all the things that they were terrified to look at initially and then came to a conclusion that their entire belief system was wrong and chose not to retreat back into it, but to take all of the rejection and the bullshit from people like you, it's really not a good look. Especially when you say things like this.
Academia doesn't quite matter to these people. I mean, sorry, I shouldn't even say academia because academia is corrupt and stupid. Academic, the people do always talk about academics. You know what I'm saying? Like,
if I was in court against Cardin, I would yield all of my time to him just so he could say more things.
Ask them like just basics.
I can't
Do cloth masks stop COVID?
Wait, I've got one too. Were Brigham Young and his followers their own distinct special race that wasn't Caucasian? Maybe figure that one out before you criticize the ex-Mormons. I'll say no more. Now, for this next one, do you remember how in the Midnight Mormons response video they were flipping in and out of the Journal of Discourses in trying to find the quotes that I had shared? Well, they opened up to a Journal of Discourse, and it was only up on the screen for a minute, but I saw something in it, and I was like, is that what I think it said? This is the discourse, and guess what it was about? It was about Brigham Young berating from the pulpit women whose children made noise in church meeting. And he really went after them. Let's take a closer look. I will say, in regard to the sisters who bring children here to make a noise, they have never yet sufficiently thought, nor sufficiently considered their own place in this world, nor the place of others, to know that there is any other person living on the earth but themselves, and they think, when they hear people talk, that it is a noise through a dark veil. I cannot say much for the education, based on good feeling, that such persons have. Were I to describe it in a plain way, I should say that they are people of no breeding, that they were never bred but came up. That is about as good a character as I can afford to give any mother that will keep a squalling child in a meeting. I have never said to the congregation, look and see who they are, for you may distinguish by your ears, without looking, the mothers that have had good teaching and been brought up in a civilized society. And it gets even worse on the bottom paragraph. Were I a policeman, I would follow a practice of my father's. It used to be a word and a blow with him, but the blow came first. I should act upon that plan when persons are holding caucus meetings in or about our congregations. If they would not desist, I would rap them hard enough for them to take a hint without my speaking. So essentially, assaulting mothers in church because their children are behaving like children. And it goes without saying that I found it pretty damn hilarious that the Midnight Mormons couldn't even open the Journal of Discourses without something like this being shown, and I feel like that's a pretty accurate indicator for what you'll find in the Journal of Discourses. And speaking of the Journal of Discourses, somebody left a comment under the Midnight Mormons video that I found hilarious. What if he's doing this as a plot to get people to read the Journal of Discourses who wouldn't normally read it? Bingo. See, the Lord's not the only one who gets to work in mysterious ways. But for real, though, if Mormons would actually read their own church history, and they don't even have to go to evil anti-Mormon sources to get it, literally just go to the church's Journal of Discourses website and read through it, so much of what the church has unfortunately successfully hid from the membership would be known. Another fun caveat is that the Journal of Discourses, which is basically a compilation of all the talks given by the church leadership throughout the years, has been disavowed by the church. It does not get more crystal clear than that. They were speaking as prophets of God, speaking for him on his behalf. And then the church, with a flick of a pen and the stamp of approval, it's no longer true. All right, here's the last clip I'm going to show you guys before we move to the end.
It's hard to prove something that doesn't exist.
It's hard to prove something that doesn't exist. Exactly. That's what the atheists have been saying for a long-ass time. Jonah was referring to the quotes that I shared that he couldn't find, but it also applies to gods, leprechauns, mermaids, and all the other made-up fictitious creatures that don't exist. You can't prove that they're not there, because in order to do that, you would have to literally be in every place, everywhere in the universe in order to prove that they don't exist. It's impossible. You can't do it, which is why we have the logical fallacy of burden of proof. You don't assume that everything is real until it's disproven, because you can't. You have to go on the evidence, and then once there's sufficient evidence, that's when you say, okay, we have a reason to believe that this thing exists. How much evidence is there for God? The exact same amount of evidence as for fairies and leprechauns. Now, I would be remiss to not show you guys the comments section. Some of the comments that I saw underneath the Midnight Mormons video that Believing Mormons left, and it's fascinating. Let's take a look. This is just a smattering of some of the comments that I think do a pretty good job of showing you where the average Mormon is psychologically. So starting at the top, wouldn't be the first time that opponents of the saints fabricated lies in order to stir up anger, hatred, and incite violence against us. Who is inciting violence against you? Like, do you think that's what my video was doing? Or do you think that other people are doing that? The persecution complex is so embarrassing. Now, if you do want to get a taste of what persecution feels like, you might try talking to a member of one of the many groups of people that your church targets. Women, gays, lesbians, trans people, anyone who leaves the church, just to name a few. Read your own history. Next quote. They have been forging false quotes from the beginning because they do what their father, who is the father of lies, taught them. Blessed are you when men speak all manner of evil against you falsely. That also didn't age well. Next one. What? You mean people make up things about our church that isn't true? You mean they lie about us? Sorry, sarcasm is my thing. Great video, guys. Love what you're doing. Okay. Light is increasing. Darkness has had its 6,000 years to educate us in evil and good. Conflict is done. Cut it short. Thank you, brethren, for your contribution. First of all, if you think the world is 6,000 years old, it's time to pick up another book. And then my favorite one, just wait until he makes a response video to try to defend the quotes, LOL. And speaking of cringy quotes, let's take a look at a couple that the Midnight Mormons left in response to people who didn't agree with their point of view. You know we could just block you, right? You know you exist in your self-proclaimed capacity of this channel's Satan, your words, not mine, by the graceful patience of our moderators, right? Your entitlement seems to blind you, and you forget that you can only make fun of this channel and its silly beliefs by the patient grace of our comment regulators, right? You are not some benevolent catfish keeping us moving. Your behavior is juvenile and unconstructive at best. Fools mock, but they shall mourn. I hope the pride with which you engage in your mockery is self-regulated before the Lord finds a method of regulating it in His way. Man to man, child of God to child of God, I hope you can try and learn some humility and temperance and respect before the universe, eager to maintain its balance, finds it for you. Yeah, the secondhand embarrassment, involuntary, my apologies, of having to read those, overwhelming. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you haven't forgotten about these bad boys. So, where did they come from? ChatGPT. While I was researching for my initial video, it had just barely come out. And since ChatGPT keeps a record of the conversations you have with it, here are the screenshots. I asked, please list each quotation of Brigham Young's hostility toward the natives and include the sources for each. Now, as you can see, there isn't a word on your screen right now that isn't true to Brigham Young's views regarding the natives. So when the Midnight Mormons made their video claiming I had written fake quotes, I was confused. After all, ChatGPT had given me the sources, and I didn't think it would just create fictitious quotes and sources, and so I went back to it and just straight up asked it. Where did you get these quotes from? I apologize for any confusion caused by my previous responses. The quotes I provided were not directly sourced from specific historical documents or records. They were generated based on the general style and content of the statements that were historically attributed to Brigham Young regarding Native Americans. So you constructed the quotes based on what we know about Brigham Young's views about the Native Americans? Yes, that's correct. The quotes I provided were constructed based on the general themes and attitudes that are known to have been expressed by Brigham Young and others of his time toward Native Americans. And to address this and others part, I'm fully aware that the and others part could mean that ChatGPT was conflating Brigham Young's views with the views of other people, which obviously wouldn't have been giving him a fair shake. But as I've already proven ad nauseum, the quotes provided by ChatGPT were absolutely in alignment with the views and the behavior of Brigham Young. Just because they weren't verbatim doesn't mean that they weren't accurate. Because the quotes provided no new information that I hadn't already discovered while researching this topic, it didn't ever occur to me that something was off. The quotes were just more of the same. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I went back to ChatGPT to see if there was any way that I could wordsmith the way I asked the question to get back only verbatim real quotes. Here's what I said. What actual word-for-word quotes that aren't fabrications can you provide that articulate Brigham Young's racist views of the Native Americans? In return, it gave me 5 more quotes, so how did it do? It got 3 out of the 5 correct, and I know that because I verified each and every one of them. And just for the fun of it, let's go ahead and take a look at quotes 2 and 3. I say, rather than that apostate should flourish here, I will unsheath my bowie knife and conquer or die. Now, you nasty apostates, clear out or judgment will be put to the line and righteousness to the plummet. If you say it is right, raise your hands. And he said this from the pulpit. Sacrament meeting hit different back then. And number 3, when a white man mixes his seed with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so. Or at least until the church decided he didn't mean that. Now, before we move on, is it my intent to in any way try to downplay the fact that I made a mistake? No. Even though the mistake I made was an honest one, it was still a mistake nonetheless, and that means that I owe my audience an apology. So this is me saying, I broke the egg. I should have verified every single one of the quotes I shared, but I didn't, and that's a mistake I'll only be making once. So to my audience, I hope that you'll please accept my apology. Now, Midnight Mormons. To make the groundless accusation that I'm a sick, twisted racist trafficking in human misery for the sole purpose of evoking pain out of the natives, or at least what's left of their tribe, so that I can make a little bit of money and have ex-Mormons like me? Disgusting. In your excitement to finally score a point on the internet for Mormonism, it seems you may have accidentally put the cart before the horse. It should be crystal clear to anyone with a pulse that the only thing your video was successful in doing was further tanking your own credibility, assuming there was any there to begin with. Had you guys chosen to take even a peek outside your echo chamber and actually research this topic, you might not have said this.
I'm searching through this as a member of the church, trying to find horrible quotes that our prophet said, but my surprise was that these things are just fake.
Now that you know that these things did happen, and the extermination order did occur and was carried out, I wonder what you'll do. As you make your decision, just keep in mind, Kwaku, that we all heard you say this. You can't be a prophet if you're saying these things, okay? You said that when you really believed that I didn't have anything, and that I was bluffing. And now that you know that's not the case, what are you going to do? So is Brigham Young still a prophet? And Midnight Mormons, you also made it very clear in your video that you are big fans of repentance. So here's a few ways you might consider getting started. First, and this can be our secret, I won't tell Down Jokes that you're out here apologizing to people, but you could apologize for the claims that you made about me. And if you don't feel ready to do that, you could at least maybe walk me through step by step, being careful to connect each dot as to how you arrived at this conclusion, because frankly, it still baffles me. Secondly, since the technique you guys used in your last video of searching for quotes to try to find if they were real or not live in front of your audience was such a wild success, why don't we do that again with every single one of the quotes that I shared in this video? And I'm not kidding. I mean, let's really do this. I will come on your show. I will bring tons of quotes that you guys have called evil anti-Mormon lies, and we can live fact check whether or not they are at least real quotes in front of your audience. And then we don't even have to debate about whether or not somebody should leave the church over them. We would just simply research the quotes and see if they were actually taught by the church and then leave people to come to their own conclusions. If you guys are actually up for that, I will literally come on your show. And lastly, given everything that we've covered in these two videos, I would love to hear your take on whether or not you still believe Brigham Young was a prophet. And if you don't believe that anymore, maybe you could also comment on what that means about the current men who stand and claim that they are prophets for God as well. So let me know. I am always down for a good conversation. And with that, I think I've said just about everything that I want to say. Thanks to everyone who stuck with me through these two videos, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And in the meantime, don't forget that life can be infinitely more beautiful beyond God and religion. Take care.